Day 46. The valley felt unfamiliar this morning, not because anything was wrong, but because nothing was pressing down on us anymore. I woke expecting to hear something I could react to: a mortar, a rifle crack, the whine of incoming. Instead, I heard ordinary sounds: men coughing, someone scraping mud off a boot, a generator starting and running without being hurried into silence. The enemy was still there, that much was clear, but their presence had shifted farther out, like a tide that had reached its limit and begun to pull back without drama. The ridges were no longer crowded. Observation posts that once tracked every movement were empty or manned by a few figures who watched without urgency. I ordered patrols, but carefully short distances with experienced men. This was not the moment for boldness. It was the moment for confirmation. The reports came back consistent. Enemy units remained in place farther back in defensive posture with no new digging toward us. No effort to reclaim ground we had touched days earlier. The airstrip operated smoothly all morning. Aircraft came in on schedule, unloaded methodically, departed without haste. In the afternoon, I walked the perimeter slowly, taking time to look at what weeks of pressure had done. Fighting holes reinforced beyond necessity, trees cut back in desperate arcs of fire, ground worn smooth by men who had lived in the same meter of earth for too long. This place had absorbed us. Men talked more today, not loudly, not foolishly, but with the rhythm of people who no longer expected interruption every time they spoke. Laughter came once or twice, sharp and brief, like a test of whether it was allowed, and I didn't stop it. As evening fell, the hills stayed quiet. No enemy probing, no statement shots, just the sound of wind moving through branches that were finally allowed to sway again. That night, I sat awake longer than necessary, not because I feared an attack, but because my mind was finally catching up with my body. Images I'd postponed began to surface: the boy we buried, the Hmong civilians running, the sound of the ground lifting under arc light. Survival delays memory. It doesn't erase it. Day 46 ended without contact, and for the first time, the absence of contact didn't feel like a trap. It felt like closure beginning, slow, careful, incomplete, but real. The siege was over, but the war was not. Tomorrow would be about holding what remained, and learning how to live in a place that had nearly killed us. Day 47. Day 47 felt like standing in a room after a storm has passed, unsure whether the roof is truly intact. The morning came quietly, but not empty. There was movement everywhere. Our movement. Men carrying crates instead of ammunition belts, radios being checked instead of clutched, boots walking without hugging shadows. It was the first day where we filled the valley more than the enemy did. I woke early and walked alone for a while, moving through positions that had once been fought over inch by inch. Fighting holes were still there, worn smooth by weeks of elbows and fear. Some still smelled of cordite and sweat. Others were already being reshaped, improved, turned from emergency shelters into something more permanent. The enemy remained present, but distant. The ridges that once felt like clenched fists now felt like open hands, still capable of closing, but relaxed. Patrols went out, but with restraint. Every man sent forward had clear limits and clear instructions: observe, confirm, and return. In the afternoon, we accounted for everything: men, weapons, losses, and damage. Names of soldiers killed in action were spoken quietly and written down, acknowledged properly. War allows grief only after it is finished with you. I stood with a few of the older fighters while they smoked, watching the hills. No one talked about victory. No one talked about revenge. We talked about rice, about weather, about where we would sleep if we were sent away from here. That's how you know a fight has ended. As dusk fell, Long Tieng looked like itself again. Scarred, quieter, but recognizable. Fires burned low and controlled. Lights were used carefully, but without panic. That night, I slept without my boots on for the first time in weeks. I still woke when the wind shifted. I still listened for impacts that didn't come. But my body finally accepted what my mind had been resisting. The siege was over. Day 47 ended not with relief, but with acceptance. We had held. We had endured, and now we had to live with what holding had cost. Day 48. 2 days after the grip loosened, the valley finally began to believe it. I woke to sunlight that didn't feel intrusive. It lay on the airstrip like it belonged there, not like a spotlight inviting fire. The ridges were still occupied. No one pretended otherwise, but the posture up there had shifted fully into defense. Binoculars showed fewer heads, longer gaps, men moving with routine instead of urgency. The morning was spent on things that had waited too long, reorganizing squads that had been mixed by casualties, redistributing weapons properly instead of by desperation, remarking sectors that had blurred during the worst weeks. These tasks sound small, but they are not. They are how units remember who they are. I watched a young fighter, one who had cried during the withdrawal weeks earlier, stand his watch with calm eyes and steady hands. No one commented. Growth in war doesn't announce itself. In the afternoon, I authorized deeper patrols than before, not chasing, just confirming distance. They returned reporting enemy lines well back from the valley rim, dug in for holding, not pushing, no fresh trails downhill, no forward caches. The enemy had made his decision stick. I stood on a rise overlooking Long Tieng and felt something heavy lift. Not from my shoulders, but from behind my eyes, the tension that had lived there since February finally loosened. That night, the valley slept deeply. Watches rotated smoothly. Radio stayed quiet. The jungle spoke in its old voice. Lying there, I thought about how sieges don't end with cheers. They end with maintenance, with counting, with men learning how to stand without leaning into the next blow. Day 48 ended without a shot fired. And for the first time, that silence felt earned, not borrowed. Day 49. Morning arrived with work instead of worry. That's how I knew something fundamental had changed. Men were already moving before I gave orders. Hauling timber, reshaping fighting holes into proper positions, clearing debris that had been left untouched, because survival had mattered more than cleanliness. No one rushed. No one hid. Movements were economical, purposeful, almost civilian in rhythm. The enemy remained where we expected them to be, farther out. Higher up, watching but no longer leaning forward. Patrol reports were consistent. Defensive posture, minimal movement, no preparations for renewed pressure. Whatever enemy decision had been made days ago was holding. Around midday, Hmong civilians began to return. Not many, not confidently, a few families at first, stepping carefully into the valley as if it might reject them. Hmong children stayed close to legs. Adults scanned the hills the way soldiers do, even if they didn't know why. To the American, Lao and Thai, Long Tieng was just a military base for them. But to us Hmong people, Long Tieng was our capital, our home, our life, a shining beacon. In the afternoon, I took time to sit with my squad leaders and talk. Not about tactics, but about men who needed rest, who was carrying too much inside, who might break later, when there was finally room to feel. This is the part commanders rarely talk about. As evening approached, Long Tieng looked almost gentle in the fading light. Scarred hills, broken trees, but also smoke from cooking fires that weren't afraid to rise straight up. At dusk, I stood alone for a moment near the edge of the airstrip and listened to civilization creeping back to Long Tieng. That night, sleep came easily, and with it, dreams, not nightmares this time, just fragments of home. Day 49 ended with Long Tieng no longer feeling like something we were borrowing from death. It felt like something we had kept, not because we were stronger, not because we were braver, but because we refused, day after day, to leave. Day 50. I woke before dawn out of habit, then lay there for a moment realizing nothing urgent was pulling me upright. That alone felt wrong. For 50 days my body had learned a single rule. Get up before something explodes. Today the rule didn't apply. I got up anyway. The valley moved slowly, deliberately. Men stretched. Fires were lit openly but controlled. Radios carried routine traffic. Instead of clipped fear, someone whistled. A low, careless tune that would have earned a sharp look 2 weeks ago. No one stopped him. The enemy remained distant. Patrol reports confirmed. By mid-morning, higher command traffic came through. The phrase "defense successful" appeared once, buried in a longer message. No one celebrated it. Words like that don't belong to the men who paid for them. I walked the ground with my platoon one last time, not as a commander checking readiness, but as a witness. This fighting hole where a boy learned to stop shaking, that slope where we almost broke, and that patch of ground where the sky saved us when nothing else could. At noon, I dismissed unnecessary positions and consolidated properly for the first time since February. Lines were redrawn not for survival, but for sustainability, a defense meant to last, not endure. Hmong civilians moved more freely now. Children laughed once, short, startled laughter, like they didn't quite trust the sound yet. I turned away before anyone saw my face tighten. In the afternoon, I finally allowed myself to write names down. Not tallies, not reports, but names, the ones who didn't reach day 50, the ones who held long enough that others could. This is how soldiers mark endings, not with parades, but with lists. As dusk fell, Long Tieng looked almost peaceful, but not innocent. Enemies still watched from the hills. The war still existed beyond them. But this place, this valley, had survived its trial. I stood at the same observation point where weeks earlier, I had believed we would be overrun by nightfall. The ground felt solid now, not borrowed. Day 50 ended without noise, and that silence meant more than any victory shout ever could, because the defense of Long Tieng was no longer something we were doing. It was something we had done. Day 51. The morning came with paperwork. That's how I knew the battle had truly passed its peak. Not forms exactly, lists and tallies the higher-up requesting for. The kind of quiet administrative weight that only shows up when bullets stop demanding attention. Radios carried measured voices, asking for numbers instead of coordinates. Supplies were logged instead of fought over. Even time felt different, no longer chopped into seconds between impacts. I hated it more than I expected. Paperwork means reflection. I forced myself through it anyway. The enemy remained a distant, with patrols confirmed no forward movement. By midday, more Hmong civilians returned, slowly and carefully. They walked into the valley like people returning to a burned home, grateful it still stood, afraid of what they might find inside. Children stared at us without curiosity, only recognition. They knew what uniforms meant now. I ordered my men to help where they could, carrying bundles and clearing paths. In the afternoon, I gathered the platoon. Not for orders, but for grounding. We sat together under cover and talked about practical things: rotations, rest, and equipment repair. As evening fell, the valley filled with ordinary sounds again. Cooking, conversation, the thud of wood being stacked. No one rushed to darkness. No one flinched when a board dropped. That night, I slept with my rifle nearby out of habit. Not necessity. Dreams came heavier now, pulling at memories I'd kept buried under urgency. Day 51 ended without incident, without movement, without threat, and for the first time since February, the silence didn't ask anything of us. It simply existed. Day 52. The morning smelled different, not cordite, not burned earth, but with smoke, thin, steady, human. I noticed it before I noticed the light. People were cooking again, not in a hurry, not hiding fires under tarps, just cooking the way people do when they believe they'll still be there to eat. That belief changes how a place feels more than any fortification. The enemy stayed at distant. Patrol reports were the same old boring report. No enemy movement forward, no fresh digging, no weapons repositioned toward us. By midday, command traffic shifted again, less urgency, more planning. Questions about sustainability instead of survival, about how long units could stay and what could be rebuilt. This is how wars move on without telling you. In the afternoon, as evening approached, the valley filled with sound. Not loud, not joyful, just alive with hammering, voices, laughter that stopped and started like it wasn't sure it was allowed yet. I stood near the edge of the airstrip at dusk and watched the last CIA Air America aircraft lift off, clean and unchallenged, that felt like progress. That night, I slept deeply and dreamed of walking uphill without carrying anything. No rifle, no pack, just walking. Day 52 ended quietly, and in that quiet was the beginning of something we hadn't had in a long time: recovery. Day 53. Morning came with planning instead of bracing. I noticed in the way radios sounded. Longer transmissions, less clipped. Questions about next week instead of next hour. When a place survives a siege, time stretches again, and that stretch can feel unfamiliar. The enemy remained distant and unchanged. Patrols reported the same old pattern. The airstrip continued to operate smoothly, with Hmong civilians moved more confidently today. Not rushing, not celebrating, but settling. A woman swept dust from in front of a doorway that had no door anymore. A man marked off a small garden space with sticks. These acts mattered more than any official declaration. In the afternoon, I walked with a young fighter along the perimeter. One of the quiet ones. He hadn't spoken much since February. As dusk approached, the valley felt wider again. Not physically, but mentally. That night, the sky was clear and full of stars. I lay awake for a while, not listening for movement, but letting my thoughts wander. Day 53 ended without incident, without threat, without tension worth noting. Long Tieng had stopped being a moment of crisis and started becoming a place with a future again. Day 54. The first sound I heard that morning was a hammer. A man was repairing a roof. That sound carried farther than gunfire ever had. I stood still for a moment and let it echo. Hammer strikes mean planning. They mean someone expects the weather to matter again. The enemy remained distant and quiet. Patrols reported the same old posture of no signs of renewed interest in the valley. The airstrip operated smoothly all morning, with fuel trucks moved openly. By late morning, reconstruction efforts took shape organically, not ordered, initiated. Men filled sandbags where shrapnel had torn gaps. Others cleared debris from paths that had become dangerous during shelling. Soldiers and civilians worked side by side without needing coordination beyond nods and shared tools. That kind of cooperation only appears when fear loosens its grip. I reminded my men quietly, surviving the siege does not make us immune to war. As evening approached, the valley filled with ordinary life sounds. Metal clinking, voices calling, wood cracking under load. Fires burned steadily. No one rushed to extinguish them before dark. I walked alone at dusk, tracing the edges of the positions we had held so desperately weeks earlier. The ground felt familiar now, almost companionable. It had taken our weight, our blood, and our fear. That night, I slept without dreams, not because memory had gone quiet, but because it finally had space to rest. Day 54 ended without contact, without tension, without urgency, and that was not neglect, it was progress. Day 55. I felt at the moment I woke. The valley was calm, but my mind was busy, sorting through things it had postponed for weeks. March had been a month of endurance, of holding breath longer than felt possible. Today felt like closing a ledger, even if the book itself wasn't finished. Patrols came in with new report that enemy presence have vanished completely from the valley now. Late in the morning, I walked the perimeter with a notebook in my pocket, stopping where memory insisted I stop. This slope where we withdrew under fire, that tree line where mortars had walked closer each round, that shallow fold where we'd held the enemy at grenades distance, and somehow we held the line. All those ground looked ordinary now. In the afternoon, we conducted after-action discussions. Not formal, not polished, just men talking through moments that still hadn't settled. Civilians moved freely today, even more confidence in their steps, more time spent fixing than watching. Children ran farther from their parents than they had dared in weeks, as adults still watched the hills. But they watched with habit now, not fear. As dusk approached, I noticed how the light lingered longer than it had earlier in the month. Days were stretching, and nights no longer owned everything. That felt symbolic, whether I wanted it to or not. I stood near the airstrip at sunset and watched the last CIA Air America aircraft lift off. its silhouette clean against the fading sky.